The screen opens in black. A bell tolls once, low and broken, as though it hasn't rung in 100 years. Slowly, the shape of a ruined wooden church appears, swallowed by the Carolina pines. The walls lean inward, as if ashamed. Windows gape open like sockets stripped of their eyes. The camera drifts closer, through the doorway, into a sanctuary where dust hangs thick as breath and the floorboards groan under unseen weight. A voice enters, steady and commanding, but shadowed with menace. South Carolina, 1827. This is where the Reverend Josiah Harwood preached salvation with fire on his tongue, and where whispers claim he paid his debts in a currency more obscene than gold. His daughter's innocence, traded in silence, buried in fear, erased from memory. The image cuts to a single wooden pew, rotting in the dark. A small white ribbon lies across it, stained, brittle, and half buried in dirt. For 2 centuries, the town has lived in denial. Official histories speak of revivals, harvests, and sermons. But beneath the hymns, beneath the prayers, lay a transaction so unholy it still stains a land. Girls vanished, records burned, a family dissolved into whispers, and a church, built on scripture, became a house of rot. As the camera pans upward, beams of weak light filter through the holes in the roof, falling across the pulpit where a single Bible rests, open and hollowed. Inside, the cavity of the book yawns like a grave. Tonight, we return to the forgotten ruin of Josiah Harwood's ministry, and we confront the debt no one dared to speak of, a debt paid with flesh, a debt that never died. The screen fades to black. The bell tolls again. The year was 1827. South Carolina stood at a crossroads of hunger and pride, revival and ruin. The panic of 1819 had left the state gasping under the weight of debt. Plantations failing, small farmers broken, merchants desperate. Families clung to the church as though faith could soften hunger's edge. It was a time when the pulpit carried more weight than law, when a preacher's word could shape the fate of a town. In villages scattered to the pine forests, religion was not just belief. It was the air, the marrow, the final anchor holding fragile lives together. And among these villages, in the low hills east of Columbia, stood the wooden chapel of Reverend Josiah Harwood. He preached fire, he preached judgment, he preached the wages of sin. His voice rose like thunder over his congregation. Men with empty pockets, women clinging to their children, all desperate for some assurance that God had not abandoned them. And yet, behind that holy voice, debts mounted, land mismanaged, loans unpaid. Harwood's wealth had crumbled, but his power, the hold he kept over his people, remained unbroken. The parsonage beside the church looked plain from the outside, a lean house of wood, white paint already peeling. Yet within its walls lived a family bound by silence. Harwood's 3 daughters, pale as candle wax, eyes too old for their youth. Their laughter was never heard in the yard, their faces seldom seen beyond the church doors. The townsfolk wondered. They whispered in the fields, in the smokehouses, in the quiet of their homes. Why were the Harwood girls so withdrawn? Why did their eyes avoid the sun? Why did their father's sermons, always thunderous, tremble whenever he spoke of sacrifice? In 1827 South Carolina, poverty was a plague, and in Harwood's parish, it was not the only one. By daylight, Reverend Josiah Harwood was the very image of devotion. He stood tall in his pulpit, black coat pressed threadbare, Bible clutched in his hands as if it were forged to his bones. His voice carried fire, sharp and unrelenting, commanding his congregation to flee from lust, from debt, from the snares of Satan. He wept in prayer. He thundered in sermon. He carried himself as a man bound not to flesh, but to God alone. The town adored him, or at least they feared not to. To question Harwood was to question Scripture itself. He baptized their children, blessed their harvests, buried their dead. His hands were always present at the thresholds of their lives. To the eye of the community, he was untouchable, chosen, almost divine. But masks are carved not for strangers, but for those closest to the wearer. Behind closed doors, Harwood's piety withered into something darker. His debts pressed against him like a tightening noose. Creditors from Charleston, planters from across the county, merchants whose patience had rotted into hunger. Harwood's accounts lay barren. His land, poorly tended, gave little. His name, his reputation, was all that remained of value, and so he guarded it fiercely. To the congregation, he thundered of holiness and obedience, hammering guilt into their bones. To his creditors, he whispered in private, offering settlements no written record would ever show. It was in this dual life, saint in the sanctuary, supplicant in the shadows, that his mask hardened. Those who glimpsed behind it never spoke aloud. They turned their eyes away from the fading faces of his daughters. They silenced their suspicions, because if the Reverend fell, so too might the fragile structure of faith holding their lives together. They chose silence, and silence is where corruption festers deepest. Debt in 1827 was more than numbers scratched on a ledger. It was shame. It was ruin. It was a crack in a man's reputation that could spread like rot through an entire family. For Reverend Josiah Harwood, debt became a shadow that clung to every corner of his life. His land, once purchased in confidence, yielded little. Drought stunted his crops. The soil, overworked and tired, gave him less each season. He had borrowed heavily, first to expand his holdings, then to cover old loans with new ones, a cycle of desperation disguised as faith in providence. By the mid-1820s, the sum had grown monstrous. Charleston merchants demanded repayment. Local planters whispered about seizing his land. Even his fellow clergymen, though polite, began to draw a distance from the stench of his misfortune. But debt did not only live on paper. It ate its way into the Reverend house. Food grew scarce. Servants were dismissed. The girls, Clara, Mary, and Ruth, were dressed in the same worn frock season after season, their shoes patched until patching became impossible. Their mother, long since gone to illness, could no longer shield them from the tightening grip of poverty. It was in this crucible of desperation that Josiah Harwood's mask cracked. He would not surrender his standing. He would not see his land auctioned on the courthouse steps, nor his name dragged through the dust. The Reverend's pride was stronger than his piety, and so he looked upon his daughters not as children of God, but as assets, living currency in a town where power thrived in silence. No written record would ever prove what followed. Only whispers remain, carried through generations like a disease. Whispers that debts were paid, not with coin, but with flesh, that behind the peeling walls of the parsonage, the Reverend struck bargains that no ledger could contain. Debt had found its payment, and the cost would echo for centuries. Every man of debt searches for a door, some hidden passage through which ruin might be escaped. For Josiah Harwood, that door was not made of wood or iron. It was made of silence. The first whispers came in spring, when a planter named Elias Crowder was seen leaving the parsonage at night, his lantern extinguished, his boots stained with mud. He had been one of Harwood's loudest creditors, demanding repayment with a cruelty sharpened by his own failing fortunes. Yet after that night, his tone softened, his threats ceased. When asked if the Reverend had cleared his debts, Crowder only smiled thinly and changed the subject. Others followed. A merchant from Charleston, whose patience had frayed to the edge of violence, suddenly forgave a portion of Harwood's account. A banker, long mocked for his hunger for collateral, stopped pressing for signatures. All of them, one by one, began to visit the parsonage under the veil of darkness, and all of them emerged quieter, satisfied, their ledgers mysteriously lighter. The town noticed. They always notice. But to notice is not to act. To notice is to whisper, to avert the gaze, to protect the fragile fabric of a community held together by denial. They told themselves Harwood must have found some secret benefactor, some stroke of providence. Yet mothers clutched their daughters tighter when the Reverend's shadow passed. And then there were the Harwood girls. Clara, eldest, her gaze broken and downward, as if bearing a weight no child should know. Mary, her hair shorn abruptly, as if to erase what beauty might draw eyes. Ruth, the youngest, pale and sickly, who no longer sang in the churchyard. The bargain was never spoken aloud. It was never written. But its evidence lived in the silence of the girls, and in the sudden mercy of men who once threatened to strip Harwood bare. Sin had become a currency, and the Reverend was its broker. Silence has many forms. For the Harwood girls, it became both shield and prison. Clara, the eldest, carried herself with the stiffness of someone far older than her years. At 16, she had already learned the art of erasure. Her voice small, her presence minimized, her eyes never meeting another for long. When spoken to, she answered in fragments, as if speech itself might betray her. Those who remembered her childhood recalled a girl once full of song, singing hymns in a yard with a clarity that made the heart ache. But by 1827, her voice was gone. Silence had swallowed it whole. Mary, 2 years younger, bore her father's shadow in a different way. Her hair, once admired by parish women for its golden sheen, was suddenly hacked short, uneven, as if someone had taken scissors in a fit of cruelty. She walked quickly, her head lowered, hands clenched tightly around the hems of her dress. Whenever the congregation gathered, she hovered near corners, avoiding both gaze and touch. If she laughed, no one remembered it. If she cried, the sound never escaped her throat. And then there was Ruth, only 12. She was the most fragile of the three, her body slight, her cheeks bloodless. She often missed services, shut away in the parsonage under claims of illness. The rare time she appeared, her eyes seemed ringed with shadows, as though she had not slept for days. Her skin bore the pallor of candle wax, and she flinched at sudden noises like a bird accustomed to the hunter's hand. Together, the three were a portrait of silence, walking to the town like ghosts still tethered to flesh. And yet no one asked, no one pressed. In a community where shame could destroy a family as swiftly as poverty, questions remain buried. But silence is never empty. It echoes. It amplifies what it conceals. And in the Harwood household, silence was the loudest sound of all. Every town carries secrets, but it is not the secret itself that defines them. It is the silence that follows. In Harwood's parish, silence was currency, silence was armor, silence was survival. The townsfolk noticed. They could not avoid it. Mother saw the way Clara's eyes no longer lifted, how Mary shrank from touch, how Ruth grew frilier by the week. Fathers muttered in barns and fields about creditors who suddenly forgave debts after late-night visits to the parsonage. Children whispered that the Harwood girls were cursed, though none could name why. But no one acted, not openly, not where it mattered. To speak against the Reverend was to speak against God's chosen. His sermon still thundered. His prayers still filled the chapel with trembling voices. Families depended on his blessing for weddings, for baptisms, for funerals. The Reverend's hand was woven into the rituals of their lives, and to sever it would unravel the fragile fabric holding them together. So they chose denial. They told themselves the girls were merely shy, that Harwood's creditors were merciful men moved by charity, that whispers of unholy bargains were nothing more than envy or spite. They chose to look away when the Harwood daughters passed in silence, their bodies stiff with unspeakable weight. Even those who suspected the truth locked their lips. For in small towns, Shame is not individual. It is collective. To expose the Reverend would expose them all. Their failure to intervene, their cowardice, their willingness to let innocence burn so long as the altar flame still flickered. And so complicity grew roots. The congregation sang louder, prayed harder, as though their hymns could drown the sound of what they refused to confront. But silence does not erase. It buries. And what is buried always waits to rise again. Silence does not remain still. It spreads. It infects. And in Harwood's parish, silence began to swallow more than the Reverend's daughters. The first disappearance was quiet, almost forgettable. A family, tenant farmers on the edge of town, packed suddenly in the night. Their eldest daughter, a bright-eyed girl of 15, had been seen speaking with Clara not a week before. By morning, their house stood empty, the hearth still cold, possessions left behind in disarray. The father claimed later, in a letter scrawled from Georgia, that the land had turned against us. But those who knew whispered otherwise. Something had driven them out, something they dared not name. Then another, a merchant's niece, visiting from Charleston, failed to return after an evening service. Her family raised alarm, but the Reverend assured them she had departed earlier than expected. Weeks later, her body was found miles away, washed into the reeds of the Congaree River. The cause of death remained uncertain, and still the townsfolk did nothing. They rationalized. They prayed. They told themselves such tragedies were merely chance. The dangers of a harsh land, of wild rivers, of fate itself. Yet each disappearance left behind a trail of unease, a pattern that clawed at the edges of their minds. By 1828, whispers became unavoidable. Families spoke of daughters who grew suddenly silent after time spent near the Reverend's parsonage, of girls who left town under shadowed circumstances, their names stricken from records, their fates swallowed whole. Even mothers who feared for their own children could not bring themselves to accuse them aloud. To accuse Harwood was to accuse themselves, their complicity, their cowardice, their refusal to protect the innocent. Easier than to let the missing become myths. Easier to let the silence grow. But silence never stays buried forever, and the disappearances were only the beginning. South Carolina in the 1820s was dotted with orphanages, charitable in appearance, brutal in truth. Children without families were swept into them like refuse, stripped of names, identities, and futures. These places existed in shadow, dependent on donations from churches and wealthy patrons, their ledgers rarely scrutinized, their inner workings concealed by piety. Reverend Harwood, despite his debts, kept a curious connection with one such institution in Charleston. Records, faded, incomplete, half-burned, suggest he corresponded with the matrons of the Charleston Orphan House. He sent donations too meager to be remembered, yet his name appeared frequently in visitor logs. No one ever asked why a rural preacher, drowning in financial ruin, would have such persistent business with city orphanage. But oral accounts tell a different story. In hushed tones, elders recall that girls who fell silent in Harwood's parish sometimes found themselves relocated. Parents too poor or broken to resist, families desperate to erase shame, entrusted their children to him, and he in turn delivered them into the custody of institutions that thrived on vulnerability. The children entered as orphans though their parents lived. They vanished into a system where paperwork disguised every cruelty. It was said that Clara, Mary, and Ruth often visited the orphanage under their father's supervision. Witnesses remembered them not as companions to children, but as watchers, thin, withdrawn girls who move among the broken like reflections of their own fate. If Harwood's debts were a snare, the orphanage became his marketplace. Whether through influence, barter, or something more unspeakable, he turned the suffering of children into a ledger of survival. The Charleston Orphan House still stands, though altered, its history sanitized for visitors. But in certain corners, the walls peeled to reveal older layers of brick, stone that once heard the cries of children no one claimed. And beneath those cries lies the echo of Harwood's bargain, stretching beyond his parish, into the very institutions meant to protect the innocent. Every crime leaves a record, though not always in ink. With Josiah Harwood, whispers tell the ledger, one never intended for the congregation's eyes. It was said to be a book bound in cracked leather, hidden behind the pulpit or beneath the parsonage floorboards. Within its pages, debts were tallied in Harwood's own hand. Names of creditors appeared alongside cryptic notations, symbols, initials, and most disturbingly, the faint sketches of crosses beside certain girls' names. These were not mere calculations of land or coin. They were accounts written in flesh. Those who claimed to have glimpsed it described entries that chilled the blood. Crowder settled. Wilmot half satisfied. M. delivered. The handwriting was neat, precise, the script of a man accustomed to writing sermons, now turned to recording sins. Each entry paired with a date, often aligning with the sudden easing of debts or the vanishing of a girl from the parish. Whether the ledger truly existed is a question history cannot fully answer. Some believe it was destroyed when suspicion grew too loud. Others whisper it was confiscated by church authorities, locked away in archives that will never see light. And there are those who claim it still lies buried in the ruins of the parsonage, eaten by damp, its words festering in silence beneath the rotting beams. Yet fragments survive in oral memory. Entire families recounted how their daughters' names appeared in the Reverend's secret book. They spoke of the dread that fell when Harwood called upon them, his hand heavy with both blessing and unspoken demand. If the ledger was real, it was more than record. It was scripture rewritten, a testament to corruption cloaked in holy ink. For every line written, a life was altered, innocence extinguished, and in the neatness of Harwood's pen, the enormity of his betrayal gleams most clearly. A preacher's Bible guides the soul, but his ledger revealed the price of silence. Reverend Harwood's sermons thundered across the parish like storms rolling off the Carolina hills. He spoke of purity, of obedience, of the price of sin. He preached that the flesh was weak, that daughters must submit, that fathers must shepherd their households with unyielding discipline. To the faithful, these words rang with fire and brimstone urgency, but beneath the surface, they carried a second meaning, one only discernible in hindsight, once the whispers had sharpened into suspicion. Congregants remembered his fixation on the image of sacrifice. Again and again, he returned to the story of Abraham binding Isaac, of the offering demanded by God. But when he spoke, his voice lingered not on Abraham's faith, but on Isaac's obedience, the silence of the child, the submission of innocence to the will of the father. Some shuddered when they recalled it years later. The way Harwood's eyes seemed to glisten with a hunger not of heaven, but of something human and corrupted. Even his prayers carried a strange cadence. He thanked God for debts forgiven, but his tone trembled, as if the forgiveness he sought came not from above, but from the men who had crossed his threshold at night. He called upon the congregation to guard their households against shame, but his voice quavered when his gaze fell upon his own daughters, their faces pale beneath the church's flickering candles. At the time, no one dared to speak of it. To question a sermon was to risk damnation. To challenge a reverend was to sever oneself from the only thread of spiritual and communal life the parish possessed. So the congregation swallowed his words whole, allowing the double meanings to nest like parasites in their souls. Only later, when the disappearances could no longer be ignored, did survivors look back and wonder, had Harwood been confessing all along? Were his sermons not warnings but riddles, veiled proclamations of the bargain he struck, spoken in plain sight beneath the very cross he defiled. The words were there. The truth was there. And still they sang amen. In the winter of 1833, an itinerant preacher named Ezra Van made a discovery that threatened to undo what little order remained in Abbeville. He claimed to have unearthed a hidden text buried beneath the Reverend's old pulpit, an unmarked leather-bound book written in a hand no one could entirely identify. The townsfolk called it the Book of Revenants. It bore no title on its cracked spine, no author's name within its brittle pages, only fragmented sermons and half-legible confessions scrawled in ink that bled into the parchment like old wounds. The writing spoke of bargains struck not with men but with shadows, with entities that promised prosperity in exchange for offerings of blood and innocence. Among the names repeatedly scratched into margins was that of the Reverend himself, alongside the initials of prominent families whose fortunes had inexplicably risen after 1827. Ezra, a man already viewed with suspicion for his unorthodox beliefs, carried the book into the town square and read aloud passages that accused the church of orchestrating rituals disguised as debts. The words burned like hot coals against the collective conscience of the people. But the congregation's response was not outrage. It was terror. Old women wailed, men clenched their jaws, and children were ushered away. Within hours, Ezra vanished. Some claimed he fled, others that he was dragged screaming into the swamp by forces older than the Reverend himself. The book, too, disappeared, though fragments of its pages surfaced decades later in the possession of collectors who swore they heard whispers when they opened it. From that moment on, the church pews stood half empty. The faithful whispered that sermons were not prayers but incantations, meant to bind their children into the same covenant that had damned the Reverend's bloodline. By the 1840s, Abbeville was no longer the same town it had been before the Reverend's shadow fell upon it. Outsiders noticed first. The merchants who traveled through its crooked streets, the soldiers who camped nearby during maneuvers, the strangers who swore they would never return. They said Abbeville carried an air of wrongness, a quiet distortion that clung to the air like damp smoke. The children were the first signs. Too many were born with pallid skin and eyes clouded gray, as though they had been looking at the world from beneath water. Some never learned to speak, only hummed low hymns that seemed older than the town itself. Others drew circles in the dirt compulsively, perfect and unbroken, their fingers bloody from repetition. Mothers whispered of infants born without breath, yet whose tiny mouths still formed the shape of prayers when the church bells rang. And then there were the deaths. Sudden, inexplicable. A farmer found face down in his field, his mouth packed with dirt. A young woman discovered hanging in her attic, though no beam had ever existed in that part of the house. Horses collapsing without reason, their eyes wide, their bodies unmarked, as if some invisible hand had pressed the life out of them. Each death was hushed, each incident folded into silence, but the town's collective dread grew heavier by the year. Some said Abbeville had become a vessel, its soil steeped in offerings, its water carrying whispers, its sky unable to forget the smoke of the Reverend's bargains. When strangers passed through, they reported feeling watched even when walking alone, as if the very houses leaned forward to observe them. The truth, buried in diaries and hidden letters, was far darker. The Reverend's blood debt had not ended with him. It had metastasized, twisting the land itself, binding the descendants of Abbeville to a covenant they had never agreed to. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Abbeville found itself caught between allegiances, but the violence outside its borders only echoed the rot within. Soldiers marched through, some never leaving, their bones buried in shallow graves by the edge of the swamp. Yet what they carried into Abbeville was more than muskets and banners. They brought disruption, the kind that awakened what had lain dormant. It began with the church bell. For decades it had rung dully, as though the iron itself resisted being struck. But when the 1st Regiment camped nearby, the bell began tolling at midnight, unstruck, its sound hollow and wet, as if water dripped inside the metal. Each time it rang, someone died, soldier or citizen alike. Sometimes they collapsed with no wound. Other times their bodies turned rigid, eyes glassed over with the same gray she'd seen in Abbeville's children. The soldiers spoke of nightmares. They dreamed of a man in a clerical collar, his face a shifting blur, offering them absolution in exchange of their tongues. A Union officer scrawled in his diary that he awoke to find his men kneeling in rows before the church, mouths sewn shut with black thread, humming in unison. At dawn, they swore they remembered nothing. Local families fared no better. Food spoiled within hours of being harvested. Cattle bellowed to the night until their throats tore raw, and the air thickened with a coppery tang. It was as though the war had broken a thin veil holding the covenant at bay, allowing whatever had been buried beneath the Reverend's sermons to seep freely into the present. The strangest reports came from soldiers who deserted after a single night in Abbeville. They swore they saw children walking in the dark woods, their mouths moving in silent hymnody, guiding shadows older than the town itself. The war ended, but the town's curse only deepened. Abbeville's true battle was never with the Union or the Confederacy. It was with a covenant that no one dared name aloud. When the guns fell silent and the Confederacy lay in ruin, Abbeville should have found relief. Instead, it sank deeper into itself, a wounded body retreating from a world. The war had torn the South apart, but for Abbeville, the greater wound was unseen. The covenant awakened by bloodshed had made its presence undeniable. Travelers avoided the place. Maps began to omit it. Merchants steered their wagons around its outskirts, and those who did stumble into town often left whispering that the air itself felt hollow, as though sound refused to settle, as though voices did not truly belong to the mouths that carried them. For those who remained, life became ritualistic, an endless cycle of survival through silence. Doors were locked at dusk. Windows were covered with cloth, not against intruders, but to keep eyes from gazing in. Children were warned never to follow the sound of singing past the tree line, for sometimes voices echoed there, perfectly imitating the hymn sung in church decades earlier. It was during this era of isolation that a new horror surfaced: the stillborn choir. Entire households reported infants born with no breath, no pulse. Yet when midnight came, their tiny chests rose and fell with eerie rhythm, and a faint humming escaped their lips. Mothers clutched their lifeless children, torn between grief and a terror that froze them into silence. No graves were dug for these infants. Instead, they were quietly placed in wooden boxes, left in the church basement, where the faithful claimed to hear them at night, dozens of soft voices blending into one unholy hymn. By 1870, Abbeville was a place whispered of but never visited. Its isolation was its survival, and yet it also became its prison. The covenant was no longer bound to the Reverend's bloodline alone. It had become the marrow of the town itself. The land, the water, the families, all locked in a pact that could not be named but could always be felt. In the autumn of 1889, a man named Professor Lawrence Keating arrived in Abbeville, a historian from Charleston. He had heard fragments of rumor, whispers of a cursed town, where the church bells tolled without a hand, where infants sang in death. To him, these stories were superstition worth cataloging, the kind of folklore that filled the margins of Southern history. But Abbeville was not a myth. It was a wound that still bled. Keating kept a meticulous journal, later discovered in a private archive. His first entries are filled with the clinical eye of a scholar. Descriptions of the decayed church, the boarded windows, the townspeople who would not meet his gaze. Yet as his days stretched into weeks, the entries shifted. His tone cracked. His hand grew erratic. He wrote of sleepless nights where hymns drifted to the shutters, though the streets lay empty. He claimed he found footprints, bare, small, childlike, circling his inn, though no children were seen in town. One passage describes the church basement. A deacon, perhaps desperate to unburden himself, gave Keating the key. Inside, Keating wrote, the air was thick and sweet, cloying like spoiled fruit. He swore he saw wooden boxes stacked against the walls, their lids trembling ever so slightly. They do not rest, he scrawled in a hurried hand. The covenant binds them still. They breathe in the silence. They hum to the stone. After the basement, Keating's entries unraveled into fevered fragments. He wrote of shadows that followed him, of reflections in the window where his own face seemed replaced by a blurred clerical visage. His last legible note was a single line, written 3 times in shaking ink. Asterisk, the Reverend's debt was never his alone. It is the marrow of this place. Asterisk, Keating never returned to Charleston. His journal was found in his abandoned room, pages damp, corners blackened as if licked by flame. By the turn of the century, Abbeville had begun to consume itself, not with fire or famine, but with silence. The people learned that the only defense against the covenant was amnesia. Memory itself had become dangerous, for to remember was to awaken. The town records were the first to go. Ledgers that once traced births and deaths were torn from the courthouse shelves and burned in the square, the ink rising into the night as black smoke. Family Bibles, once treasured heirlooms, were locked in trunks or fed to the flames, as though the names inscribed in them might summon back the ones who had never truly left. Even gravestones were pried from the earth, their inscriptions chipped into dust, until the churchyard became a field of blank markers, rows of nameless stone, identical and faceless. But forgetting was not perfect. Some things refused to be erased. Children still woke screaming in the night, whispering names no living person had taught them. Midwives reported that infants clutched at the air as if pulling something unseen toward themselves. The church basement, though sealed with iron, still exhaled faint lullabies on storm-heavy nights. By 1905, Abbeville was no longer marked on most maps. Locals told outsiders it had never been more than a settlement, swallowed long ago by swamp and poverty. But within its shrinking population, the covenant held tighter than ever. The people lived as shadows of themselves, mute, joyless, avoiding mirrors, avoiding questions. Some said they had succeeded in burying their past. Others knew the truth. History had not been erased. It had simply gone underground, waiting to be unearthed by another hand bold or foolish enough to dig. By 1917, the outside world had begun creeping toward Abbeville again, no matter how tightly the town tried to seal itself away. The war in Europe created a hunger for timber and coal, and surveyors arrived in the Carolina backwoods, maps in hand, searching for untouched land to strip and sell. To them, Abbeville was little more than a forgotten settlement, a patch of soil left behind by progress. They did not know that progress itself had been kept out deliberately. The first crews came with axes and dynamite, marking trees with red paint, driving stakes into the ground. But within days, their camp fell silent. Letters sent to Charleston described unease among the men. Strange songs drifting through the forest at night, the sound of children's laughter echoing in places where no children lived. One foreman scrawled in his notebook that he awoke to find every tree stake pulled from the earth, driven instead into the soil around his bed in a perfect circle. He left the next morning and never returned. Still, industry pressed forward. A second crew arrived, this time with armed escorts. They found the first camp abandoned, tools rusting, tents shredded as though by claws. The men reported seeing pale figures at the edge of the woods, small shapes swaying in rhythm, humming hymns that no one recognized but all felt in their bones. By dawn, one of the armed escorts was missing. His rifle lay propped against a tree, and his boots were neatly placed side by side, empty. News of these incidents never reached the papers. The companies wrote the area off as unsuitable for development, but within Abbeville the whispers spread. The covenant had grown restless, and the land itself rejected intrusion. For the people, this was both a blessing and a curse. The outside world would never take their soil, but also meant the covenant's grip would never be loosened. By the 1930s, Abbeville had all but vanished from the maps. A place swallowed in swamp and silence, a place that was never named aloud in the outside world. Yet those who lived within its decaying borders understood. The covenant was not gone, and it was not contained. It was a seed planted in their marrow, in their water, in their breath, a debt that could never be paid, only passed on. Travelers who strayed too close during the Depression years told strange stories when they returned. Some spoke of voices rising from the soil, like sermons whispered into the roots of trees. Others described children standing perfectly still at the edge of the road, their lips moving in silent prayer. And always, there was a figure of the Reverend, sometimes seen in a reflection, sometimes in a dream, sometimes stepping across the threshold of an abandoned church as though he had never died at all. But perhaps the most chilling truth was this. Abbeville's story was not unique. Across America, hidden in orphanages, churches, seminaries, and forgotten towns, there were other debts, other covenants sealed with innocence and silence. The Reverend's sin was not his alone. It was a mirror of something buried deep in the nation's soul, an inheritance of corruption and sacrifice, repeated in shadows wherever faith became power and power demanded flesh. In the end, Abbeville did not collapse in flames or flood. It endured, quiet and unseen, its people living half-lives beneath the weight of an ancient bargain. To walk its streets today, if one could still find them, would be to feel the breath of history pressing close, the hymn still vibrating beneath the ground. And if you listen long enough, if you let the silence close around you, you might hear it too. Asterisk, the covenant was never broken. It was only waiting, asterisk,